Most people are afraid of what's hiding beneath the ocean. But the truth is, the scariest things don't always come from below. Sometimes it's a captain who suddenly turns into a killer. Sometimes it's a ship full of people that simply vanishes. Sometimes it's something no pilot can identify hovering above the water. And sometimes the ocean leaves you completely alone. Hundreds of miles from land with no way to escape. The 7 stories you're about to see actually happened, and each one proves that the middle of the ocean can become one of the most terrifying places on Earth. Number 7. Number 7 takes us off the coast of Southern California in November of 2004. For nearly 2 weeks, the radar operators aboard the USS Princeton had been watching something they couldn't explain. Objects were appearing at extreme altitude, dropping toward the ocean at impossible speeds, and then simply stopping, hovering over the water for hours before vanishing. At first, they assumed it was a glitch. They recalibrated the radar systems, checked every sensor, ruled out every error they could think of, but the contacts kept coming back. So, on the morning of November 14th, they decided to send someone to look with their own eyes. That someone was Commander David Fravor, one of the most experienced pilots in the entire fleet. Fravor wasn't alone. A second fighter jet flew beside him, which meant 4 trained military aviators were now staring at the same patch of ocean, expecting to find a drone, a downed aircraft, anything with a logical explanation. What they found instead was the water itself. Below them, the surface was turning white and violent, foaming over an area roughly the size of a commercial airliner, as if something massive was moving just beneath the waves. And then they saw it. Hovering directly above that disturbance was a smooth, white object around 40 feet long, shaped like a giant capsule. No wings, no windows, no exhaust, no rotors. Nothing that could explain how it stayed in the air. According to Fravor, it didn't move like a plane and it didn't move like a helicopter. It darted and shifted as if it were inspecting something under the surface. Fravor decided to get closer. He banked his jet and began descending toward it in a slow spiral. That's when he encountered stopped feeling like an observation and started feeling like a response, because the object began to climb. The 2 of them circled each other over the open ocean, closer and closer, until, in an instant, the object shot away faster than anything Fravor had ever seen and disappeared completely. Seconds later, the Princeton came back over the radio. The object had reappeared on radar 60 miles away in under a minute. Here's what keeps this case from fading into rumor. A second crew was sent to the area, and one of the pilots managed to capture an object just like it on infrared camera.
My God. Look at this thing. Oh my gosh, dude. Wow.
That clip became known as the Tic Tac video. And in 2020, the US Department of Defense did something almost unheard of. It confirmed the footage was real. Not alien, not explained, just authentic, recorded by the Navy and still classified as unidentified. David Fravor would later repeat his account under oath in front of the United States Congress. More than 20 years later, with witnesses, radar logs, and officially verified footage, no one has been able to say what these pilots actually saw that day over the Pacific. Number 6. Number 6 begins not with a shipwreck, but with a light. For generations, the people of Block Island, a small patch of land off the coast of Rhode Island, spoke of a strange glow that appeared over the water on winter nights. Some describe it as a distant flame, others as a torch drifting in the dark, and a few swore that, every so often, the light took the shape of an entire ship wrapped in fire. They called it the Palatine Light, and according to the legend, it was the ghost of a vessel that had been lost more than a century before. condemned to return again and again to the place where something terrible had happened. But every ghost story starts somewhere real, and this one started with a ship called the Princess Augusta. In August of 1738, the Princess Augusta left Rotterdam carrying hundreds of immigrants, many of them from a German region called the Palatinate, which is where the ship would later get its nickname. They were ordinary people, leaving everything behind for the promise of a new life in the American colonies. They never imagined what the crossing would cost them. The water on board became contaminated. Disease spread through the lower decks. Food ran short. Storms battered the ship for weeks, and one by one, the passengers began to die before they ever saw the coast. Among the dead was the captain himself, George Long, which left command in the hands of his first officer, a man named Andrew Brooke. And here is where the story turns dark. According to statements taken after the wreck, Brooke allegedly began forcing the surviving passengers to pay for what little food remained, even the sick, even the dying, even those who had nothing left to give. By the time the Princess Augusta finally reached Block Island on December 27, 1738, in the middle of a snowstorm, much of the crossing was already dead. The survivors who remained were frozen, starving, and barely able to stand. And then the ship struck the shore near Sandy Point. What happened next depends entirely on who you ask. In the gentler versions, the islanders are rescuers. They help the survivors ashore and bury the dead. But over the years, far darker tellings took hold. In some, the islanders weren't saviors at all, but wreckers who lured the ship in with false lights to make it run aground so they could strip it off everything aboard. In others, the crew themselves had brutalized the passengers and abandoned the ship to its fate. And then there's the story of a woman, sometimes called Mary Vanderlyn, who was left behind on the ship. Whether she was forgotten, refused to leave, or had simply lost her mind after so much suffering, no one agrees. But according to the legend, when the Princess Augusta was set ablaze and pushed back out to sea, the woman was still aboard, and her screams could be heard from the shore as the ship burned in the darkness. Here's the unsettling part. Historians have spent years trying to separate the truth from the folklore, and much of the cruelty in this story may have been exaggeration, rumor, or memory twisted over time. There may have been no false lights. The ship may never have been deliberately burned at all. And yet, not long after the wreck, the sightings began. A burning light over the water near the very spot where the Princess Augusta had run aground, appearing, some said, around the anniversary of the tragedy. In 1811, an island resident named Dr. Willie described it as a fire seen miles offshore, sometimes small as a window's glow, sometimes as large as a ship moving across the water like a torch. To this day, no definitive wreckage of the Princess Augusta has ever been found, no proof of the darkest versions of the tale. Only the memory of a ship full of immigrants who crossed the Atlantic under unimaginable conditions, arrived in pieces, and a light that for nearly 300 years has refused to go out. Number 5. On the morning of November 10, 1955, the captain of a merchant vessel sailing near Fiji spotted something strange in the distance. It was a ship, but it wasn't moving like one. It was drifting, listing heavily to one side, abandoned to the mercy of the ocean. And the closer he got, the worse it looked. The vessel was leaning so far to port that part of a railing was dipping in and out of the water. The windows were shattered, the upper structure was damaged, and someone had rigged a makeshift canvas awning over the deck, as if a person had been trying to shield themselves from the sun out there for days. The name was still readable on the hull. It was the MV Joyita. When the crew climbed aboard, they found a scene that made no sense. There was no one, no captain, no crew, no passengers. All 25 people who were supposed to be on that ship were gone. and so were the dinghy and all the 3 life rafts. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. The people aboard had abandoned ship. But that only made it stranger, because even damaged, listing and partly flooded, the Joyita was still floating. To understand how it got there, you have to go back several weeks to October 3rd, 1955, when the Joyita left the port of Apia in Samoa, bound for the Tokelau Island. It was a routine trip of about 270 miles, expected to take less than 2 days. On board were 16 crew and 9 passengers, along with several tons of cargo. This wasn't some flimsy boat either. The Joyita had been built in 1931 as a luxury yacht in Los Angeles, later used by the US Navy during the Second World War and eventually converted into an island cargo ship. But there were warning signs before it ever left port. One of its engines had failed and the repair couldn't be finished in time. The captain, Thomas Dusty Miller, decided to set sail anyway, running on a single engine. The Joyita was supposed to reach Tokelau on October the 5th. That day came and went with no sign of it. No distress call had been received, so a search was launched. For days, aircraft swept an enormous stretch of the Pacific looking for the ship or any trace of the people aboard. They found nothing. No wreckage, no rafts, no bodies. The Joyita had simply vanished until it reappeared near Fiji, hundreds of miles off the course it was supposed to take. The closer investigators looked, the deeper the mystery became. The radio was tuned to the international distress frequency, which suggested someone had tried to call for help. But the antenna cable was broken and had been painted over, meaning the radio's actual range was only a few miles. In other words, they may very well have screamed for help and almost no one could hear them. It only got stranger from there. The ship's electric clocks had all stopped at 10:25, likely the moment the power died in the night. The logbook was missing. So was the sextant, several navigation instruments, and the weapons the captain kept on board. On deck, investigators found a doctor's bag with a stethoscope, a scalpel, and bandages stained with blood. But no one could ever establish who had been hurt or what had happened to them. Down in the engine room, they finally found the beginning of an explanation. A corroded cooling pipe had burst, slowly letting water into the lower hull. The pumps were clogged. Someone had tried to install a backup pump but never connected it. The one working engine had been covered with mattresses, possibly to protect it from the rising water as the ship listed further and further. All of that explained why the Joyita was damaged, why it was flooded, why it was listing, but it didn't explain the one question that mattered most. Why did everyone leave? Because here is the detail that turns this from a tragedy into a genuine mystery. The Joyita was nearly unsinkable. Its hull was lined with cork to keep cargo cold, and it carried dozens of empty drums that made it even more buoyant. According to experts, even flooded and crippled, it was extremely difficult for that ship to ever go fully under. In fact, when it was towed back to port and drained, it floated again, perfectly stable. So why would 25 people abandon a ship that almost certainly would not sink, climbing instead into open rafts into the middle of the Pacific? The official inquiry concluded that the captain had been negligent to sail with failing engines and a broken radio. But the fate of the 25 people was ruled in plain terms inexplicable. Over the years, theories came anyway. An injured captain, panic, a mutiny, a fight between officers, passengers who thought they saw land. Later came whispers of pirates, of Soviet submarines, even of fraud. None of them could explain the whole picture. Decades later, the case is still open. The 25 people who boarded the Joyita have never been found, and the ship that refused to sink eventually ran aground on a beach in Fiji, where it was left to rot away, taking whatever it knew with it. Number 4. On November of 1961, Dr. Arthur Duperrault, a successful optometrist from Wisconsin, finally made a dream come true. He took his wife, Jean, and their 3 children, Brian, 14, Terry Jo, 11, and little Renee, just 7, to Florida, where they chartered an elegant sailboat called the Bluebell. The plan was to sail the Bahamas and escape the winter. Arthur called it the vacation of a lifetime and promised they'd be home by Christmas. To captain the boat, they hired Julian Harvey, a decorated war veteran and expert sailor who brought along his 6th wife, Mary Dean, to cook for the trip. For 5 days, everything was perfect. And then, on the night of November 12th, something happened. The next morning, a passing oil tanker spotted a man adrift in a small lifeboat, screaming for help. It was Captain Harvey. With him was the lifeless body of 7-year-old Renee. Harvey told a heartbreaking story. A sudden, violent storm had snapped the masts, split the hull, and set the boat on fire. He tried to save them all, he said, but he could only recover Renee's body. It was a tragedy, a terrible accident at sea. Except 4 days later, the story fell apart. A Greek freighter crossing the Providence Channel spotted something white in the water, too small to be a fishing boat. As they drew closer, the sailors were horrified. It was a girl, blonde, in a white blouse and pink corduroy pants, waving weakly from a tiny cork float barely half a meter wide, while sharks circled beneath her. It was Terry Jo. She had been alone on the open ocean for 4 days, and she was still alive. When word reached the Coast Guard, Harvey was being questioned again. An officer told him that Terry Jo had survived. In that instant, his face changed. He forced out the words, "That's wonderful news," but his nerves betrayed him, and he asked to go rest. Instead of going to see the girl, Harvey checked into a cheap motel under a fake name, wrote a short note, and took his own life. And once he was gone, the truth came out. When Terry Jo recovered enough to speak, she told investigators what had really happened on the Bluebell. That night, she'd been woken by screaming, her brother Brian desperately calling for their father. She climbed up to find her mother and her brother lying in pools of blood. Nearby was the body of Mary Dean, the captain's wife. And then Julian Harvey appeared, holding a bloodied knife, and forced her back down below deck. As the boat filled with water, Harvey simply climbed into a lifeboat and rowed away, abandoning an 11-year-old girl on a sinking ship. But in the final seconds before the Bluebell went under, Terry Jo managed to free a small cork float and threw herself into the sea, with no food, no water, wearing only a thin blouse, alone in the vastness of the channel. The investigation revealed the rest. Julian Harvey was a man drowning in debt, with a disturbing history of profitable accidents. 2 months after marrying Mary Dean, he'd taken out a life insurance policy worth twice as much if she died accidentally. The conclusion was chilling. Harvey planned to murder his wife and fake an accident for the money. He was likely caught in the act by Arthur Dupprault, and to leave no witnesses, he decided to kill the entire family. He nearly got away with it. The only thing standing between Julian Harvey and the perfect crime was an 11-year-old girl who refused to die. Number 3. Number 3 is what happens when there is no law left, and one man decides to become it. On October of 1628, a Dutch ship called the Batavia set sail from the Netherlands on its very first voyage, bound for the East Indies. On board were more than 300 people, sailors, soldiers, merchants, and ordinary families chasing a new life, along with a fortune in silver coins and gold. But the ship was carrying something more dangerous than treasure. Among the passengers was a man named Geronimus Cornelis, a disgraced apothecary fleeing financial ruin and accusations of heresy. During the long voyage, Cornelis quietly grew close to the ship's captain, and together they began plotting a mutiny to seize the silver and gold for themselves. They never got the chance, because before the mutiny could happen, the ocean made its own plans. In the early hours of June 4, 1629, the lookout spotted white foam in the darkness and shouted a warning, but it came too late. Batavia slammed into a reef off the coast of Australia. The impact was devastating. Around 40 people drowned before they could reach land. The survivors, more than 180 of them, washed up on a cluster of small, barren islands with no fresh water and almost no food. Knowing they would all die of thirst, the ship's commander took a small boat and a handful of navigators and set off across open ocean to find help. It was a desperate, near impossible journey, and it left more than 180 terrified, defenseless survivors behind, under the control of Hieronymus Cornelis. This was the moment he had been waiting for. With no authority left to stop him, Cornelis convinced the survivors to make him their leader. Then, under the excuse of rationing the scarce supplies, he ordered every weapon, every boat, and every tool to be handed over to him. He sent a group of soldiers to a distant island to search for water, fully expecting them to die there. And then, with everyone else disarmed and helpless, he began to kill. He decided the provisions wouldn't stretch far enough, so he simply started removing people, at first under false accusations, then openly. It became a massacre. Cornelis rarely killed with his own hands. He preferred to force his followers to do it, turning them into accomplices, binding them to him in blood. Men, women, and children were dragged from their shelters in the night to be stabbed, have their throats cut, or be thrown into the sea to drown. According to survivor accounts, he once tried to poison a baby, and when it didn't work, ordered the child strangled. A preacher was made to sit at Cornelis' own table and watch as nearly his entire family was slaughtered. The island had become hell. But his reign of terror began to crack because of the man he'd sent away to die. On their distant island, those soldiers had found exactly what Cornelis lacked: fresh water and abundant food. And when fugitives began arriving with stories of the killings, the soldiers did something Cornelis never expected. They organized. They built crude weapons from the wreckage, raised a small stone fort, and prepared to fight back. When Cornelis learned they were still alive, he attacked again and again, and failed every time. Finally, desperate, he tried to negotiate in person. It was a fatal mistake. The soldiers ambushed him and took him prisoner. And then, on the horizon, a sail appeared. A rescue ship, returning at last 3 months after it had left. Of the more than 300 souls who had set out on the Batavia, only around 100 remained. Cornelis had his hand cut off before he was hanged. Centuries later, when divers finally found the wreck, they pulled up coins, jewelry, and skeletons bearing the unmistakable marks of extreme violence. Proof that the nightmare on those islands had been entirely, horrifyingly real. Number 2. In May of 1884, a small yacht called the Mignonette set sail from England bound for Australia. At barely 50 feet long, she was never built for an ocean crossing that long or that dangerous, but an Australian lawyer had bought her and hired a crew to deliver her across the world. There were 4 men aboard: Captain Tom Dudley, an experienced and respected sailor, 2 crewmen, Edwin Stevens and Edmund Brooks, and a 17-year-old cabin boy named Richard Parker, an orphan with little experience at sea who saw this voyage as his first great adventure. Remember that name, Richard Parker. For weeks, the journey went smoothly. Then, on July 5th, roughly 1,600 miles from the nearest land, a massive wave struck the yacht with such force that Dudley knew at once the Mignonette would sink within minutes. The 4 men barely had time to scramble into a tiny wooden lifeboat just 13 feet long, grabbing only a couple of cans of turnips. No fresh water, nothing else. And now the real ordeal began. They drifted in the open Atlantic, hundreds of miles from anywhere. They fought off a shark with their oars. They caught a small turtle, which bought them a few more days. But with no rain to collect, the lack of water became unbearable. By the 13th of July, they were so desperate they began drinking their own urine. And young Richard Parker began to fade faster than the rest. On his agony, the boy did the one thing every sailor knows you must never do. He drank seawater. It made him violently ill and soon left him slipping in and out of consciousness. By July 20th, Parker could no longer move. And that's when an old, dark tradition began to creep into the minds of the others. It was called the custom of the sea, an unwritten rule that, in the most extreme circumstances, lots should be drawn to decide who would die so the others could live. Dudley suggested drawing lots. Brooks refused, but Dudley and Stevens looked at the dying boy, the weakest, with no wife and no children, and convinced themselves his death was already inevitable and that it could be useful. On July 24th, after nearly 3 weeks adrift, Dudley said a short prayer. Then he went to the boy with a pocket knife and cut his throat. For days afterward, the 3 men survived on his body, an act Dudley would later describe as something done by men who had become like crazed wolves. On July 29th, a passing German ship rescued them. And here's the strange part. The survivors didn't hide what they'd done. Convinced the custom of the sea justified it, they confessed openly the moment they reached England. But the British government chose to prosecute, to end the tradition of survival cannibalism once and for all. Dudley and Stevens were sentenced to death, later reduced to just 6 months in prison. The case changed maritime law forever. But that's not the detail that haunts people. Because 46 years earlier, in 1838, the writer Edgar Allan Poe had published his only novel, a story about 4 men shipwrecked adrift in a small boat, but decide that one of them must die so the others can eat. And the name of the character they kill was Richard Parker. Number 1. In the late July of 1945, the USS Indianapolis was sailing under absolute secrecy. The heavy cruiser had just completed one of the most critical missions of the entire Second World War, delivering the components of the first operational atomic bomb. With that cargo gone, the ship was now crossing the Pacific alone, no escort, and no sonar to detect what might be waiting beneath the surface. Just after midnight on July 30th, the Japanese submarine fired 2 torpedoes into her side. The first tore off the bow. The second struck the center of the ship and triggered a chain reaction in the ammunition stores, nearly splitting the cruiser in 2. In just 12 minutes, a ship the size of a football field vanished beneath the waves. Of the nearly 1,200 men aboard, around 900 made it into the water, many of them wounded, covered in oil, with no lifeboats. They told themselves rescue would come soon. It wouldn't, and that was only the beginning. Because no one was coming. The Navy had failed to act on their distress signals, and no one had ever reported the ship missing when it never arrived. The survivors were scattered across the open Pacific, clinging to each other, waiting for help that didn't know they existed. And the blood, the noise, and the thrashing in the water had already drawn something toward them. Hundreds of sharks. They were mostly oceanic whitetips and tiger sharks, among the most aggressive in the ocean, able to sense prey from enormous distances. At first, they fed on the bodies of those who had already died, but then they turned on the living. The sailors pulled themselves into tight groups, believing there was safety in numbers. But the sharks began circling those clusters tighter and tighter. And every time a man drifted to the edge or floated alone, the attack came in an instant. A shark rising from below, dragging him under, leaving nothing but a spreading stain of red that only drew more predators in. And the sharks were the only one enemy. The sun blistered their skin. With no fresh water, desperate men made the fatal mistake of drinking seawater, which drove them into delirium and madness. They began to hallucinate, imagining islands on the horizon, fountains of fresh water below the surface, and some swam down to find them, and never came back up. Others, lost to madness, turned on their own crewmates. A chaplain who swam between the groups trying to keep their spirits alive was himself taken by a shark. For 4 days, this went on. 4 days in the water, surrounded by the dead and the dying, waiting to find out who would be next. Rescue came almost by accident. On August 2nd, a patrol plane spotted an oil slick, and then, to the pilot's horror, hundreds of men scattered across the sea. One pilot defied orders not to land in open water, set his plane down on the waves, and began pulling in the most isolated survivors, even tying men to the wings to keep them out of the water. That night, a ship arrived and switched on its searchlights, a light some men mistook for angels. Of the nearly 1,200 men who began that voyage, only 317 survived. To this day, it remains the worst shark-related disaster in recorded history. The ocean is still one of the most mysterious places on Earth. And if you think these stories were disturbing, wait until you see what people have actually captured beneath the surface. Click the video on your screen now, because the next mystery is even harder to explain.